The crystalline thorns were already pumping venom through Lyric's Nethys's bloodstream when Commander Vex Torin reached her, her agonized screams echoing across the copper-red wasteland of Scarith Prime like a banshee's wail that would haunt his nightmares for decades to come. "Don't move!" Vex barked, his scarred hands steady despite the chaos erupting around them. The blue-skinned woman had tumbled backward into a grove of razor-sharp mineral formations, each translucent spike now embedded deep in her thighs and lower back, like some sadistic sculpture crafted by a demented artist. Her purple hair, normally woven with ceremonial platinum threads that marked her diplomatic status, was now matted with sweat and the strange phosphorescent fluid that leaked from the wounded crystals, a substance that pulsed with malevolent bioluminescence. "Extract them," Lyrics gasped, her silver eyes wide with pain, and something Vex had never witnessed in her before: genuine, soul-deep terror. Not the calculated concern of someone accustomed to having problems solved by subordinates and political immunity, but the raw horror of someone who suddenly understood that death was stalking her with predatory patience. Vex knelt beside her, his military-grade environmental suit protecting him from the hostile atmosphere that Lyrics had arrogantly insisted she didn't require protection from just 18 minutes earlier. The bitter irony wasn't lost on him. "I warned you about these mineral forests," he said grimly, reaching for his field medical kit with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd treated battlefield wounds under enemy fire. "Scarathian venom spines aren't just razor-sharp, they're parasitic, and they're feeding on you right now." 25 minutes earlier, their transport vessel Quantum Drift had plummeted into this desolate ravine after electromagnetic storms had fried their navigation systems and left them tumbling helplessly through Scarith Prime's chaotic atmosphere like a leaf in a hurricane. Vex had tried to convince the obstinate Nethesian diplomat to remain inside the relative safety of their damaged ship while he conducted reconnaissance and assessed their tactical situation. But Larix Nethys, daughter of Supreme Chancellor Kairos Nethys, and quite possibly the most infuriating passenger he'd ever been assigned to escort in his 17 years of military transport duty, had other plans. "Your species perpetually assumes catastrophe," she had declared with that particular brand of condescension that seemed genetically encoded in highborn Nethesians, stepping from the wreckage in her formal traveling robes while completely ignoring the environmental hazard warnings flashing desperately on his scanner. The crimson alerts had been unambiguous: atmospheric toxins, unstable geological formations, predatory wildlife, and something the sensors couldn't classify but ominously labeled as unknown parasitic organisms. "Nethesians have conquered far more hostile worlds than this mineral-crusted wasteland. My people were taming death worlds when humans were still cowering in caves from lightning storms." What Vex didn't know, what the intelligence briefings had failed to mention, was that Lyrix's arrogance masked a deeper desperation. She was running out of time before her arranged marriage to Governor Thane's eldest son, a political union that would end not just her freedom, but her secret research into xenobiological evolution. Hidden in her diplomatic luggage were data cores containing years of unauthorized studies, research that could revolutionize interspecies medicine, but would be destroyed the moment she became a traditional political wife. The marriage contract had been signed when she was 16, sealing her fate before she'd even understood what she was losing. For the past decade, she'd watched her older brothers pursue their own careers and interests while she was groomed to be a living treaty, a beautiful ornament to cement political alliances. The bitter resentment had festered for years, but she'd never found the courage to openly defy her father, until now. Vex had suppressed his first 4 responses, all of which would have violated approximately a dozen diplomatic protocols and definitely gotten him court-martialed for insubordination. Instead, he'd managed, "Ma'am, with all due respect, those safety protocols exist because Scarith Prime has a documented mortality rate of 43% for unprotected exposure to the native ecosystem." "Statistics," Lyrics had dismissed with an imperious wave of her silver-marked hands that caught the harsh glare of Scarith's twin sons. "Fabricated by your military bureaucracy to justify their paranoid policies and budget overruns." But as she'd spoken those words, Vex had noticed something that his diplomatic briefings hadn't prepared him for: the way her voice caught slightly on the word paranoid. the subtle tremor in her hands that suggested she wasn't as confident as she appeared. In that moment, he'd realized that her arrogance might be armor against something deeper, a fear she couldn't admit even to herself. Now, as Vex meticulously extracted each crystal shard from her body with xenobiological trauma forceps, he restrained the urge to deliver a scathing, "I told you so" lecture. The spines possessed an unsettling quality that his scanner was struggling to analyze. They pulsed with their own internal luminescence, and where they contacted Lyrix's blue skin, bizarre patterns were manifesting, silver lines that writhed and twisted like living circuitry beneath her flesh. But something else was happening. As Vex worked, he noticed that his scanner was picking up electromagnetic signatures from the crystals that seemed almost technological. The readings were faint, but they suggested these weren't entirely natural formations. "Something's fundamentally wrong," Lyrix whispered, her normally commanding voice reduced to a trembling thread that barely rose above the constant wind howling through the ravine, like the voices of the damned. "I feel transformed, fire and ice simultaneously, like my blood is crystallizing into molten metal." As he worked to remove the thorns, Vex found himself studying her face with an intensity that surprised him. Without the mask of diplomatic arrogance, Lyrix looked younger, more vulnerable. The silver patterns that marked her as Nethesian nobility seemed to pulse in rhythm with her heartbeat, and for the first time, he noticed how expressive her eyes were. Not just beautiful, but intelligent in a way that her public persona had hidden. "Stay with me," he said softly, his voice gentler than he'd intended. "I've got you." Lyrix's eyes focused on his face with sudden clarity. You really came back for me, even after I've been nothing but awful to you for 4 days." "It's my job," Vex replied, though they both knew it was more than that. "No," she said, her hand weakly grasping his armored forearm. "It's not. You could have left me here and reported that I died in the crash. Who would question it?" Vex's medical scanner confirmed his worst fears with a cascade of increasingly alarming readouts. The crystal spines weren't merely biological weapons. They were releasing sophisticated biochemical compounds directly into her bloodstream, substances his database couldn't identify, but were clearly causing rapid and dramatic alterations to her Nethesian physiology. His limited xenobiological medical training indicated this was catastrophic, but he had no conception of how apocalyptically bad until Lyrix's body began metamorphosing before his eyes. Her skin temperature spiked dramatically, climbing from the normal Nethesian baseline of 96 degrees to over 104 degrees Fahrenheit. Her breathing became rapid and shallow, her pupils dilated to black coins, and her heart rate accelerated to nearly triple normal parameters. Most disturbingly, the silver patterns that normally decorated Nethesian skin in subtle, barely visible traceries began blazing with inner fire, becoming more pronounced by the second, spreading across her body like some kind of luminescent infection taking root in her very DNA. "We need to evacuate you to the ship immediately," Vex said, lifting her carefully in his arms. She felt lighter than anticipated, her alien physiology different from human norms in ways that constantly surprised him. Nethesians were typically stronger and more resilient than humans, but also possessed a lower body density that made them unexpectedly easy to carry. The medical bay might contain something that can neutralize whatever those spines injected into your system. As he carried her, Lyrix's head rested against his shoulder, and despite her fever, he could smell something like starflowers in her hair, a scent that was distinctly alien yet somehow comforting. For a moment, the diplomat's daughter facade had completely fallen away, revealing someone who seemed almost fragile. "Vex," she said, using his first name for the first time since they'd met 4 days ago, when he'd been assigned to escort her to the diplomatic summit on Scarith Prime. Her pupils were dilated, and there was something primal and desperate blazing in her expression that made his pulse accelerate in ways that had nothing to do with their current crisis. "I must reveal something critical about Nethesian biology, something they deliberately omit from your xenological briefings." But before she could explain, a subsonic rumble echoed through the ravine, deep and resonant like the sound of continental plates grinding against each other. Vex looked up to witness a massive tunnel horror, a predatory arthropod the size of a military transport, emerging from a fissure in the rocks approximately 60 meters away. Its compound eyes, each the size of dinner plates, locked onto them with unmistakable predatory intelligence, and its mandibles clicked hungrily as it sampled the air with sensory organs that resembled writhing tentacles equipped with their own smaller mouths. But this wasn't just any tunnel horror. Vex's military training kicked in as he noticed the scars along its carapace, blast marks from energy weapons, precise cuts that suggested encounters with intelligent opponents. This creature was a veteran, possibly centuries old, and it moved with the calculated patience of an apex predator that had learned to hunt more than just instinct-driven prey. "Listen to me carefully," Vex said, his voice taking on the tone he'd used with green recruits in combat zones. "That thing has killed soldiers before, professional soldiers with military-grade weapons. We're not going to outrun it or outfight it conventionally." Lyrix's fever-bright eyes studied the creature with scientific fascination despite their desperate situation. "The electromagnetic signatures. Vex, I think these creatures might be connected to the crystal formations. They're not just predators, they're guardians." Vex cursed in 5 different languages, drawing his plasma sidearm with his free hand while still cradling Lyrix against his chest. The weapon would barely damage the creature's natural armor. Tunnel horrors were legendarily difficult to kill, with carapaces that could deflect most infantry weapons. But it might buy them sufficient time to reach the dubious safety of their damaged vessel. "Are you capable of running?" he asked Lyrix, though he could already observe from her glassy-eyed expression that she was in no condition for physical exertion. "I doubt I can even maintain consciousness," she admitted, attempting to push herself upright and failing completely. Her coordination was clearly compromised, and the strange silver patterns on her skin were now pulsing in rhythm with her heartbeat like some kind of alien cardiac monitor. "Vex, the burning cycle, it's initiating. I should have informed you earlier, but I never anticipated. The spines must have triggered something that should have remained dormant for decades." The tunnel horror charged with shocking speed for something its size, its 12 legs propelling it across the rocky terrain with mechanical precision that spoke of millions of years of evolutionary refinement. But as it closed the distance, something unexpected happened. The creature suddenly skidded to a halt, its antennae twitching frantically as it sampled the air around them. Vex realized what was happening. The biochemical changes in Lyrix weren't just affecting her. They were projecting some kind of pheromone signature that the tunnel horror found confusing. The creature circled them warily, clearly agitated but no longer showing pure predatory aggression. "It's confused," Lyrix murmured against his shoulder, her scientific mind still functioning despite her physical distress. "The burning cycle pheromones, they're ancient, primal. Even predators recognize them as something sacred, something not to be disturbed." Vex made a split-second decision that would fundamentally alter both their destinies. Instead of fleeing, he stood his ground, positioning himself between Lyrix and the confused predator. His military training kicked in, not the textbook procedures they'd drilled into him at the war college, but the raw survival instinct that had kept him alive through 4 major combat deployments and more minor skirmishes than he cared to catalog. He fired a controlled burst into the ground near the creature's feet, using the plasma discharge to create a barrier of superheated sand rather than trying to damage its armor directly. The tunnel horror reared back, more confused than injured, and Vex used the moment to gather Lyrix and sprint toward their damaged ship. But as they ran, he noticed something that chilled his blood. More tunnel horrors were emerging from hidden burrows, and their behavior was coordinated. They weren't just individual predators. They were working together, herding their prey toward a predetermined location. "Vex?" Lyrix called weakly, her head bouncing against his shoulder as he ran. "There's something I need to tell you about the burning cycle. It's not just biological, it's how our people bond for life. Once it starts, once it completes with a compatible mate, the connection can never be broken." "Focus on staying conscious," Vex replied, though her words sent an unexpected thrill through him that he tried to suppress. "We'll worry about Nethesian biology once we're safe." "But that's just it," she insisted, her fever-bright eyes meeting his. "If the cycle completes, My marriage to Governor Thane's son becomes impossible. By Nethesian law, I would be bound to whoever helps me through it. And Vex, I can sense your compatibility. The cycle wouldn't have triggered if you weren't. She didn't finish the sentence, but the implication hung between them like an electrical charge waiting to discharge. Inside the transport, Vex's emergency medical protocols confirmed what he'd feared. The crystal spines had introduced a sophisticated alien compound into Lyrix's system, something that was rewriting her body chemistry on a molecular level. Her vital signs were chaotic: heart rate, neural activity, hormone levels. Everything was spiking in patterns his medical computer couldn't interpret or categorize. The burning cycle, Lyrix explained weakly as Vex worked frantically to stabilize her deteriorating condition. She was positioned on the ship's medical bay examination table, her formal robes now torn and stained, her blue skin flushed with an almost radioactive luminescence. It's something Nethesian females experience exclusively under extreme biochemical stress, an evolutionary adaptation from our homeworld's lethal environment. As he worked, Vex found himself noticing details about her that his professional demeanor had previously blocked out. The way her purple hair fell in waves around her shoulders, the delicate curve of her collarbones visible through her torn robes, the subtle play of silver patterns across her skin that seemed to respond to his proximity. "Tell me about it," he said, trying to keep his voice clinical. "The burning cycle. What exactly happens?" Lyrix's silver eyes met his, and for a moment, all pretense fell away. "It's how we choose our true mates," she said simply. "Not the arranged marriages, not the political alliances. When a Nethesian female faces life or death situations, her body releases biochemical markers that can only be satisfied by bonding with someone who's genuinely compatible. It's our species' way of ensuring that at least some of our unions are based on real connection rather than politics." Vex paused in his medical scanning, a cold realization beginning to crystallize in his mind like ice forming on a window. "You're indicating those spines triggered some kind of reproductive instinct?" "Far more than instinct," Lyrix replied, her silver eyes locking onto his with an intensity that made his breath catch in his throat. "Among my people, the burning cycle is sacred. It's how we ensure genetic compatibility and species survival under crisis conditions. Once initiated, it must be completed naturally, or the female dies from biochemical cascade failure, and it can only be completed with a genetically compatible mate." The implication struck Vex like a plasma blast to the solar plexus. He'd studied interspecies compatibility during his xenobiology training, but it had always been theoretical, academic. The possibility that humans and Nethesians could actually reproduce had been documented in only 7 cases throughout recorded galactic history. But as he processed this information, another realization struck him. "Lyrix, those crystal formations. My scanner detected technological signatures. This might not be an accident." Her eyes widened with scientific curiosity despite her distress. "What do you mean?" "Someone or something might have engineered this situation. The electromagnetic storm that disabled our ship, the fact that we crashed specifically in this area with these particular crystal formations." Vex's military paranoia was beginning to surface. This could be a setup. "But who would—" Lyrix began, then stopped as understanding dawned. "The hegemony. They've been opposed to the Nethesian-Scarethian alliance from the beginning. If they could eliminate me and blame it on an accident, or," Vex said slowly, a different possibility occurring to him, "someone who wanted to trigger the burning cycle deliberately. Someone who knew about your research, about what you've discovered regarding ancient civilizations." Lyrix's face went pale. "My father. He knows about my unauthorized research. What if this whole diplomatic mission was a setup to force me into a situation where I'd have to abandon my arranged marriage?" The possibility hung between them, revolutionary in its implications. Supreme Chancellor Kairos Nethys was known for his strategic brilliance. But would he really orchestrate such an elaborate scheme to free his daughter from a political marriage he'd arranged himself? "What's our timeline?" Vex asked, struggling to keep his voice professional despite the way his pulse was hammering against his throat. "Perhaps 14 hours before the biochemical cascade becomes irreversible," Lyrix said, her breathing becoming increasingly labored. 18 at the absolute maximum. After that, if the cycle doesn't complete, she didn't need to finish the sentence. The medical readouts were already showing dangerous fluctuations in her cellular metabolism. Vex ran a hand through his hair, his mind racing through possibilities like a computer processing data streams. There has to be an alternative. Medical intervention, hormone suppressors, artificial stimulation of the necessary biochemical responses. Vex, there's something else you must understand. Lyrics reached up, her fingers tracing the scar on his jaw that he'd earned during the Proxima Rebellion when plasma shrapnel from an exploding frigate had nearly decapitated him. Her touch was scorching, and he could observe the silver patterns on her skin growing more intricate by the minute, forming geometric designs that seemed to shift and flow like living art. If the cycle completes, if the bond formed would be permanent by Nethesian law, biochemically irreversible. I would be unable to fulfill my arranged marriage to Governor Thane's eldest son. Her hand lingered on his face, and Vex found himself leaning into the touch despite his better judgment. There was something about her fevered state that stripped away all artifice, leaving only raw honesty. But more than that, she continued, her voice dropping to a whisper, I would be bound to you for life, not just legally, but emotionally, biochemically. We would share thoughts, feelings, even physical sensations to some degree. You would know me more intimately than any being ever has. Vex had known about the political marriage. It was the entire reason for this diplomatic transport mission. The Union was supposed to cement an alliance between Nethesian space and the Scarethian Trade Confederation, ending decades of territorial disputes that had cost both civilizations billions of credits and hundreds of thousands of lives. Lyrics was being delivered to Scareth Prime like a diplomatic package, a living treaty to seal the agreement. Your father will have my head mounted on his office wall, Vex said quietly, thinking of Supreme Chancellor Kairos Nethys, whose reputation for ruthlessness was legendary even by political standards. Only if we survive long enough for him to locate us, Lyrics replied with grim humor that didn't quite mask her terror. The ship's communications array was obliterated in the crash, and we're nearly 150 kilometers from the nearest settlement. Even if rescue teams are searching for us, it could be days before they reach this ravine. As if summoned by her words, another subsonic rumble shook the ravine outside their damaged ship. Through the viewports, Vex could observe more tunnel horrors emerging from hidden burrows, their massive forms silhouetted against Scareth's harsh landscape like prehistoric nightmares. There were at least 12 of them now, possibly more concealed in the shadows, but their behavior was becoming increasingly strange. Instead of attacking the ship, they seemed to be waiting, guarding the area, as if they were following orders. Lyrics, Vex said slowly, I think we're dealing with more than just animals. These creatures are being controlled somehow. They're attracted to the burning cycle, Lyrics explained, her breath coming in short gasps as waves of biochemical changes racked her body like electrical storms. The pheromones I'm releasing, they're interpreting them as prey markers. In their primitive minds, I'm an animal preparing to reproduce, which makes me vulnerable and therefore an ideal target. They'll attempt to devour me to gain access to the biochemical compounds. But they're not attacking, Vex observed. They're containing us. Someone wants us trapped here. Before Lyrics could respond, Vex's proximity sensors detected incoming aircraft. Through the viewport, he could see 3 sleek fighters approaching their position. Hegemony design, military grade, definitely not part of any rescue operation. We need to move, Vex said urgently. Now. I can't, Lyrics gasped, attempting to sit up and failing. The cycle is progressing too rapidly. Vex, if we're going to die here, there's something I need you to know. We're not going to die, Vex said firmly, gathering her in his arms again. Please, she insisted, her fevered hand gripping his arm. I need to say this. These past 4 days, the way you've protected me, the way you've looked at me when you thought I wasn't watching. I know I've been awful to you, but it was because I was terrified. Terrified of what? Of feeling something real, she admitted, her silver eyes blazing with fever and something deeper. I've spent my entire life knowing that love was a luxury I couldn't afford. And then you looked at me like I was more than just a political asset, like I was worth protecting for my own sake. Vex felt something shift in his chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with her elevated body temperature. Lyrics! I know it's insane, she continued, her words coming faster as if she was racing against time. We're from different species, different worlds. You're a soldier, I'm a diplomat. But the burning cycle doesn't lie, Vex. It only triggers for someone who could be a true mate, not just a sexual partner. And it's never been wrong. Before Vex could respond, plasma fire erupted outside the ship as the hegemony fighters began their attack. The tunnel horrors scattered, but their behavior was still coordinated, still purposeful. Vex checked his weapons inventory with growing despair. 3 power cells for his sidearm, a plasma knife with approximately 8 minutes of charge, and a handful of emergency flares that would be useless against creatures that size. Against 15 tunnel horrors and incoming hegemony fighters, it might as well be a sharp stick and some creative profanity. There's a cavern system approximately 3 kilometers northeast, he said, studying the terrain scanner with desperate hope. The display revealed a network of natural chambers carved into the ravine walls, possibly large enough to provide shelter. If we can reach it, we might be able to wait out the worst of this situation. Vex, I can barely maintain consciousness, let alone traverse 3 kilometers across hostile terrain, Lyrics reminded him, though she was already attempting to push herself upright with obvious determination. Then I'll carry you, Vex said simply. It won't be the first time I've evacuated wounded personnel across unfriendly territory. This is different, Lyrics said softly, her voice carrying harmonics that seemed to resonate in his bones. If we're isolated in those caverns, if the burning cycle continues to progress, there's only one way it can end, Vex. And once we cross that line, there's no going back. Vex met her eyes steadily, and in that moment, he realized that his feelings for her had been building since the moment they'd met. Her arrogance had been infuriating, but underneath it, he'd sensed someone remarkable trying to break free. Then we'll confront that situation when we encounter it, he said quietly. Right now, remaining here guarantees death. At least in the caverns, we have a possibility of survival. The journey across the wasteland became an odyssey of endurance and determination that would leave permanent scars on Vex's memory. He had evacuated wounded soldiers before during the Proxima Rebellion and the border conflicts with the hegemony, but never while being hunted by alien predators and enemy aircraft across terrain that seemed specifically engineered to kill anything foolish enough to traverse it. The copper-red sand shifted treacherously under his feet, concealing pit traps and more of the deadly crystal formations that had initiated their current crisis. The twin suns beat down mercilessly, and Scarth's thin atmosphere made every breath a struggle, even with his environmental suit's filtration system operating at maximum efficiency. Above them, the hegemony fighters circled like mechanical vultures, occasionally firing warning shots that kept them moving, but didn't quite kill them. It was clear they wanted Lyrics alive, at least until the burning cycle killed her naturally, eliminating the diplomatic threat she represented without leaving obvious evidence of assassination. But as they moved across the wasteland, Vex began to notice that Lyrics' condition was affecting more than just her physiology. The tunnel horrors that approached them seemed confused, agitated, but not immediately aggressive. The burning cycle pheromones were ancient, primal signals that even predators instinctively respected. "Talk to me," Vex said as they sheltered behind a rock formation while a fighter passed overhead. "Keep me focused on something other than how impossible this situation is." "What do you want to know?" Lyrics asked, her head resting against his shoulder. "You, the real you, not the diplomat. What did you want to be before politics took over your life?" A small smile played across her fevered features. "A xenobiologist. I wanted to study how life adapts and evolves across different worlds. I wanted to find the common threads that connect all living things." "That's why you were so interested in the crystal formations," Vex realized. "They're not just technology," Lyric said, her scientific passion overriding her physical distress. "They're alive in a way, ancient artificial life forms that can interface with biological systems. The architects didn't just build machines, they created living technology." 3 times he had to take shelter behind rock outcroppings while tunnel horrors passed nearby, their clicking mandibles unnaturally loud in the thin air as they searched for the source of Lyrics' increasingly potent pheromones. Vex could feel her body temperature rising against his chest, and the silver patterns on her exposed skin were now clearly visible even through her torn clothing, pulsing like a beacon that advertised her condition to every predator within kilometers. During one particularly close encounter, a tunnel horror actually investigated their hiding place, its sensory tentacles probing the crevice where they'd taken shelter. Vex held his breath and pressed himself against the rock, shielding Lyrics with his body while the creature's mandibles clicked just meters from their heads. The smell of the thing was overwhelming, a mixture of decay and sulfur that made his eyes water even through his suit's filters. But as the creature probed closer, something unexpected happened. Lyrics stirred in his arms, her silver markings blazing brighter, and the tunnel horror suddenly recoiled as if burned. For just a moment, Vex could have sworn he saw intelligence in the creature's compound eyes. Not animal cunning, but genuine awareness. "Did you see that?" he whispered. "The crystals," Lyrics murmured feverishly. "They're not just triggering the burning cycle. They're changing something fundamental. I can feel it, Vex. We're becoming something new." Lyrics drifted in and out of consciousness during the trek, her fevered ramblings revealing glimpses of a life Vex had never suspected existed beneath her diplomatic facade. The pampered chancellor's daughter was actually a trained xenobiologist who had been studying off-world ecosystems against her father's explicit orders. Her arranged marriage was designed to end her inappropriate scientific pursuits and force her into the traditional role expected of a supreme chancellor's daughter. But there was more. Hidden in her research data were discoveries about ancient civilizations, extinct species that had possessed technologies far beyond current understanding. She'd been secretly investigating reports of ruins on dozens of worlds, following patterns that suggested a vast galactic civilization that had simply vanished. "I never desired the marriage," she whispered against his shoulder as they sheltered from a particularly aggressive tunnel, horror that seemed more intelligent than the others, its behavior suggesting pack-hunting tactics. But duty to family, duty to species, duty to the greater galactic good, it's all we're indoctrinated with from birth. Individual desire is selfishness, personal choice is weakness, love is a luxury our people cannot afford. "What do you want?" Vex asked, surprised by his own question. In all his years of military service, he'd rarely had occasion to ask someone what they actually desired, rather than what duty demanded of them. "To choose," she replied simply, her voice barely audible over the sound of clicking mandibles searching for them in the darkness. "To make my own decisions, even if they're catastrophically wrong. To be permitted to fail on my own terms rather than succeed according to someone else's predetermined plan. And to find out what happened to the architects." "And personally," Vex pressed, something compelling him to understand this woman who had become so much more than a passenger. Lyrics was quiet for so long that he thought she'd lost consciousness again. Then, almost inaudibly, "To be loved for who I am, not what I represent. To wake up next to someone who sees me, really sees me, every morning for the rest of my life." The honesty in her voice made Vex's chest tighten with unexpected emotion. "Lyrics, I know it's impossible," she said quickly. "Different species, different worlds, different lives. But in my fever dreams, sometimes I imagine what it would be like if things were different." "What if they could be different?" Vex heard himself asking. "What if this situation, terrible as it is, could give you the choice you've never had?" She looked up at him with those silver eyes, and he could see hope warring with fear in their depths. "Are you saying what I think you're saying?" "I'm saying that maybe some accidents aren't accidents," Vex replied carefully. "Maybe sometimes the universe conspires to give us what we need, even if it's not what we planned." The cavern system, when they finally reached it after what felt like hours of careful movement across dangerous terrain, proved to be more than just shelter. Ancient Scarethian ruins stretched deep into the rock, evidence of a civilization that had vanished millennia before either humans or Nethetians had achieved spaceflight. The architecture was strange and beautiful, with flowing organic curves that seemed to have been grown rather than constructed. But these weren't Scarethian ruins. The design patterns matched descriptions from Lyrix's hidden research. Architect technology, preserved and waiting. Bioluminescent fungi provided dim blue-green illumination throughout the tunnel system, and an underground stream offered fresh water that Vex's scanner confirmed was safe for both human and Nethesian consumption. Most importantly, the caverns were too narrow for the tunnel horrors to follow them inside. But the ruins held other surprises. As they penetrated deeper into the cavern system, Vex discovered chambers filled with crystalline formations that hummed with residual energy. Ancient architect technology, still functional after millions of years, designed for purposes he couldn't begin to comprehend. Fascinating, Lyrics murmured, her scientific training overriding her physical distress as she examined the crystal arrays with wonder that transcended her pain. These formations aren't natural. They're some kind of amplification system, possibly for biological functions. Neural enhancement, genetic modification. The architects were far more advanced than we ever imagined. As they moved deeper into the ruins, Vex noticed that the crystal formations were responding to Lyrics's presence. Ancient systems began activating, displays flickering to life. Energy patterns that had been dormant for eons, suddenly pulsing with renewed vigor. They're responding to the burning cycle, Lyrics realized, her eyes widening with scientific excitement despite her condition. The architects designed this technology to interface with biological reproductive processes. But why? Vex established a defensive position near the cavern mouth, while Lyrics's condition continued to deteriorate at an alarming rate. The burning cycle was intensifying beyond anything his medical training had prepared him for. Her silver markings now pulsed with rhythmic light that illuminated their surroundings like a living constellation, and her body temperature had risen to levels that would be immediately fatal to a human. But something else was happening. The ancient crystal formations were responding to her presence, activating systems that had been dormant for eons. Holographic displays flickered to life, showing star maps and biological data that defied comprehension. As Vex watched, fascinated despite their dire circumstances, he realized that the displays were showing the evolutionary history of dozens of species across the galaxy. The architects hadn't just been advanced, they'd been gardeners, cultivating the development of life itself. Vex, Lyrics called softly from where he'd constructed a bed of salvaged emergency blankets and clothing near one of the crystal arrays. Her voice had acquired a quality he'd never heard before, deeper, more resonant, with harmonics that seemed to vibrate in his bones and make his nervous system respond in ways he didn't understand. I need you to comprehend something crucial. If the cycle completes, if we bond, it's not merely a marriage contract or a political arrangement. Vex turned from his surveillance of the cavern entrance, plasma knife in hand and ready for trouble. What do you mean? Nethesian bonding involves a genuine biochemical integration, Lyrics explained, struggling to focus on his face as waves of heat distorted her vision and made thinking increasingly difficult. Our nervous systems would literally merge with each other. We would share memories, emotions, even physical sensations to some degree. It's not something that can be undone or ignored. But as she spoke, the crystal formations around them began to pulse in synchronization with her words, and Vex realized they were not just dealing with Nethesian biology anymore. The architect technology was enhancing everything, amplifying the process beyond anything either of their species had ever experienced. The crystals, he said slowly, they're not just responding to you, they're upgrading the process. Exactly, Lyrics whispered, her eyes blazing with silver fire. The architects designed this technology to create something new. Hybrid consciousness, enhanced beings capable of bridging the gap between species. That's why the hegemony wants me dead. They've discovered what's happening here. As if to emphasize her point, the crystal formations suddenly projected a holographic display showing two figures, one clearly human, one clearly Nethesian, surrounded by energy patterns that merged and transformed them into something unprecedented. They were trying to create a new form of life, Vex realized, not just hybrids, but evolved beings. And we're the first successful test subjects, Lyrics said, reaching toward him with a hand that glowed with inner light. Vex, what we're about to become, it's what the architects dreamed of, but never achieved themselves. Vex felt something cold settle in his stomach, like a chunk of ice. Are you attempting to dissuade me? I'm trying to provide you with a choice, she replied, her silver eyes blazing with inner light that seemed to pierce straight through to his soul. Something I've never possessed. If you help me complete the cycle, you'll be bound to me for life in ways your species doesn't fully understand or appreciate. But more than that, we'll become something neither of our species has ever seen. Enhanced, evolved, capable of things that shouldn't be possible. The implications were staggering. They wouldn't just be bonded, they would be the first of a new evolutionary step, pioneers in a transformation that could reshape galactic civilization. Outside, the clicking of tunnel horror mandibles grew closer, echoing through the ravine as more of the creatures arrived. But now Vex could hear something else, the whine of hegemony aircraft landing nearby. They were running out of time. If you don't, she shrugged weakly, well, the choice will be made for both of us by biochemistry and death. Vex checked his remaining power cells with growing anxiety. Less than half a charge left in his sidearm, and the plasma knife was down to maybe 6 minutes of continuous use. Soon he would have to make the same choice Lyrics was offering him: duty or desire, safety or risk, the known path or the uncertain future that beckoned like a flame in the darkness of the caverns. The decision was made for him when armed figures appeared at the cavern mouth, hegemony infiltrators in advanced combat armor, moving with the precision of special forces operators. Their weapons were trained on the cave entrance, and Vex could hear their leader speaking into a communicator. Target confirmed. Nethesian female in advanced burning cycle. Termination in progress. But as the soldiers advanced, something extraordinary happened. The ancient crystal formations suddenly blazed with brilliant light, and the tunnel horrors that had been scattered by the hegemony fighters came flooding back into the ravine. But their behavior was different now. They moved with coordinated intelligence, responding to signals from the crystal network. Vex realized that the architect technology wasn't just enhancing Lyrics' burning cycle, it was creating a neural link with the local ecosystem. The tunnel horrors weren't just predators anymore. They were guardians, protectors responding to an ancient imperative. The hegemony soldiers found themselves facing not just alien wildlife, but a coordinated defense system that had been dormant for millennia. The tunnel horrors attacked with tactical precision, using the terrain to their advantage, working together in ways that defied their supposed animal intelligence. In the chaos of the battle outside, Vex made his choice. What followed was unlike anything in his experience or imagination. The Nethesian burning cycle, amplified by the ancient architect technology, was intense, primal, and transformative in ways that transcended the purely physical. As their bodies joined, Vex felt his consciousness expand exponentially, touching something vast and alien, yet strangely familiar. The crystal formations around them blazed with brilliant light, creating a symphony of energy that seemed to resonate with the very fabric of reality. Lyrics' memories flooded through him, her childhood on the Nethesian homeworld, her secret studies of xenobiology, her desperate desire for freedom from the constraints of her birth, while she experienced his memories in return. She lived through his military training, the bonds of brotherhood forged in combat, the horror of losing friends in battle, and the loneliness of a career spent traveling between worlds without ever finding a place to call home. Their minds merged and separated, like waves on a cosmic shore, each contact leaving permanent changes in both of them. But the architect technology added layers of complexity beyond anything either species had ever experienced. Their consciousness didn't just merge, it evolved, becoming something greater than the sum of their individual parts. Vex could feel their awareness expanding beyond the confines of their physical bodies, touching the network of crystal formations throughout the cavern system and beyond. Through the enhanced connection, they became aware of the hegemony infiltrators outside, could sense their intentions and predict their movements with supernatural accuracy. More than that, they could influence the tunnel horrors, directing them with biochemical commands that the creatures couldn't resist. As their bodies moved together in ancient rhythm, Vex found himself experiencing not just Lyrics' physical sensations, but her emotions, the love that had been growing between them despite their circumstances, the fear that this might be their only chance at happiness, the wonder at the transformation they were undergoing together. "I love you," Lyrics gasped as the energy around them reached a crescendo. I know it's impossible. I know it's insane. But I love you, Vex Torn. And I love you, Vex replied, the words torn from him by forces beyond his control. Stubborn, brilliant, impossible woman that you are. The energy discharge from the completed bonding sent shockwaves through the ancient crystal network, activating systems that hadn't functioned for millions of years. Throughout the cavern system, dormant technology came online, and Vex could feel their enhanced consciousness expanding to encompass capabilities that defied explanation. When the bonding was complete, Vex felt fundamentally altered, as if his nervous system had been rewired to accommodate capabilities he'd never known were possible. Lyrics lay beside him, her silver markings now stabilized in new patterns that somehow included elements that matched similar marks that had appeared on Vex's own skin during their joining. The dangerous pheromones that had attracted the tunnel horrors were already beginning to fade, replaced by different biochemical signals that proclaimed their successful bonding to any Nethesian who might encounter them. Vex could feel Lyrics' presence in his mind like a warm flame, not intrusive but comforting, a constant awareness of her emotional state and general well-being. But there was something more. The architect enhancement had created additional changes, capabilities that neither of them fully understood yet. Vex found he could sense the tunnel horrors outside the cavern with uncanny precision, their locations and intentions as clear to him as if he were looking at a tactical display. No regrets? Lyrics asked softly, her fingers tracing the new silver markings on his chest that proclaimed his bonded status to the galaxy. None, Vex replied honestly, though he knew the consequences of their actions would ripple through both their lives in ways they couldn't yet imagine. Though explaining this to your father is going to be interesting. Actually, Lyrics said, a mischievous glint in her silver eyes that reminded him powerfully of the woman he'd first met. Explaining it to the Hegemony Council might be more challenging. They just lost an entire infiltration team to alien wildlife that suddenly developed tactical intelligence. Let me worry about the political fallout, Vex said, pulling her closer and marveling at how perfectly they seemed to fit together, despite coming from different worlds, different species, different expectations of what life should be. Right now, we need to focus on survival and figuring out exactly what the architect technology did to us. The enhancement became apparent over the following hours. Vex found he could sense the tunnel horrors' movements with supernatural accuracy, predict their behavioral patterns, and even influence their actions through some kind of biochemical projection. When they finally ventured outside the caverns, the predators that had been hunting them simply left, as if they'd suddenly lost all interest in their former prey. More remarkably, the architect technology had given them access to information networks that spanned the galaxy. Through the crystal formations, they could tap into data caches left by the vanished civilization, learning about their history and their ultimate fate. Remarkable, Lyrics murmured, studying readings from Vex's scanner while simultaneously processing information directly from the crystal network. The architects didn't vanish. They evolved, transcended their physical forms, and became something beyond our current understanding. And they left these tools behind for others to follow the same path. So we're not just bonded, Vex said slowly. We're part of something larger. Exactly. And that's what the hegemony fears. Evolved beings who can't be controlled or manipulated, who represent a fundamental threat to their power structure. But even as they marveled at their transformation, Vex couldn't help but notice how beautiful Lyrics looked in the soft glow of the crystal formations. The diplomatic mask was completely gone now, replaced by someone who was wholly herself, brilliant, passionate, unafraid. You realize, he said softly, that even without all this architect enhancement, I would have fallen in love with you eventually. Even with my terrible attitude, she asked, laughing. Especially because of your terrible attitude, Vex replied, kissing her forehead gently. It told me you had fire, that you were worth fighting for. They were rescued 3 days later by a joint Nethesian-Scarethian search team that had been systematically sweeping the crash site area. Vex's emergency beacon, finally repaired using components salvaged from the ancient ruins, had reached the planetary communication network and triggered a massive search and rescue operation. But the rescue team found more than just survivors. The crystal technology had created permanent changes in both Vex and Lyrics, enhancements that their medical scanners couldn't fully understand, but clearly documented. Supreme Chancellor Kairos Nethys arrived at the Scarethian capital aboard his flagship, Infinite Dominion, just as Vex was being formally debriefed by Alliance Command. The blue-skinned patriarch was even more imposing in person than in the diplomatic files Vex had studied during his mission preparation. Nearly 7.5 feet tall, with silver hair that seemed to move with a life of its own, and eyes that could freeze blood at 100 paces. The Supreme Chancellor's entourage was equally impressive. 24 diplomatic aides, twice as many security personnel, and several individuals who appeared to be scientists or medical specialists. Vex got the distinct impression that his actions had triggered more than just a simple diplomatic incident. "Commander Torin," the Supreme Chancellor said without preamble when they were finally face-to-face in the Alliance Embassy's main conference room. His voice carried the weight of absolute authority, the kind of presence that came from ruling hundreds of millions of beings across dozens of star systems. "You have created what humans might call a diplomatic incident of unprecedented proportions." "With respect, sir," Vex replied, standing at military attention despite the informal setting and his own exhaustion. "Your daughter's safety was my primary concern throughout the mission." "Her safety, yes." The Supreme Chancellor's expression was completely unreadable, a diplomatic mask that revealed nothing of his thoughts or intentions. "According to the medical reports provided by the rescue team, she has undergone a complete burning cycle bonding, enhanced by architect technology. Such combinations are not merely unprecedented, they're legendary." Vex felt his heart rate spike, but kept his voice steady. "I am aware of that, sir." "Are you also aware," the Supreme Chancellor continued, beginning to pace around the conference room like a predator circling prey, "that burning cycle bondings enhanced by architect technology have historically produced offspring with capabilities that transcend both parent races? That such children often become leaders, innovators, and bridges between civilizations?" Vex blinked, not expecting that particular line of questioning. "Sir, my daughter has always been problematic," the Supreme Chancellor said, and for the first time Vex detected something that might have been paternal affection beneath the diplomatic formality. "Too curious, too independent, too willing to forge her own path rather than follow the one predetermined for her. Perhaps that is exactly what our galaxy requires in these turbulent times. Someone willing to explore new possibilities rather than clinging to ancient traditions and generational grudges." Lyrics entered the room at that moment, her purple hair freshly arranged in complex braids that Vex now understood indicated her changed status to anyone familiar with Nethesian customs. The silver patterns on her skin had settled into permanent configurations that proclaimed her bonded state to the galaxy, and there was something different about the way she carried herself. More confident, more self-assured, but also somehow more connected to everything around her. But there was something else. Faint lines of silver traced across her skin in patterns that seemed to shift and flow, and her eyes held depths that suggested enhanced perception. "Father," she said, offering the formal bow of respect that diplomatic protocol required, "I understand this complicates your alliance negotiations with the Scarethians." "Complications," the Supreme Chancellor repeated slowly, his gaze moving between his daughter and Vex with calculating intensity. "Can be managed. Treaties can be renegotiated. Political alliances can be restructured. The question is whether Commander Torin understands the full implications of what has occurred." Vex felt Lyrix's presence in his mind, not telepathy exactly, but an awareness of her emotional state that was part of their new connection. She was nervous but determined, ready to fight for their bond if necessary, prepared to face her father's wrath to protect what they had discovered together. "I understand that I'm bonded to your daughter for life," Vex said carefully, choosing his words with the precision of someone navigating a minefield. "I understand that this ends her arranged marriage to Governor Thane's son, and I understand that you have every right to be furious about the disruption to your political plans. Do you also understand," the Supreme Chancellor continued, moving to stand directly in front of Vex, "that Nethesian human bondings enhanced by architect technology have produced some of the most remarkable individuals in recorded galactic history? That hybrid offspring with capabilities exceeding both parent species have often become the architects of lasting peace between civilizations? Vex felt the ground shift beneath his feet. His entire understanding of the situation suddenly called into question. "Sir? My daughter," the Supreme Chancellor said, looking at Lyrics with something that was definitely pride, "has always been too curious for her own good, too independent for traditional Nethesian society, too willing to explore forbidden knowledge and challenge established ways of thinking. For years, I have worried that these traits would lead her to disaster." He paused, studying Vex with those penetrating silver eyes. "Perhaps instead, they have led her to exactly where she needs to be." "Father?" Lyrics asked, clearly as surprised as Vex by this unexpected turn in the conversation. "The electromagnetic storm that disabled your ship," the Supreme Chancellor said with a slight smile, "was not entirely natural. Neither was your crash location. I have been aware of my daughter's research into architect technology for some time, and I knew that forcing her into a traditional marriage would destroy not just her happiness, but discoveries that could benefit our entire civilization." The revelation hit both Vex and Lyrics like a physical blow. "You orchestrated this?" Lyrics asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I provided an opportunity," her father corrected. "The choice of what to do with that opportunity was entirely yours, and you chose remarkably well. The Scarathian alliance will proceed through alternative means," the Supreme Chancellor declared, with the casual authority of someone accustomed to reshaping the political landscape of entire star systems. "Governor Thane's son was never truly worthy of you anyway. Too concerned with political advancement to appreciate scientific achievement, too focused on tradition to embrace the changes our galaxy desperately requires." Vex felt as if reality had shifted around him. "Sir?" "Commander Torin, on the other hand," the Supreme Chancellor continued, "has demonstrated qualities that suggest he might actually deserve my daughter. Courage under fire, willingness to sacrifice himself for others, and most importantly, the wisdom to recognize Lyrics' true value rather than simply her political utility." "However," the Supreme Chancellor added, and Vex felt his brief moment of relief evaporate, "Nethesian tradition demands that such bondings be tested through formal trials. You will submit to the crucible of depths to prove your worthiness, or the bond will be severed artificially, a process that rarely ends well for either participant, particularly when architect enhancement is involved." The crucible of depths, as explained by Lyrics during their preparation time in her luxurious quarters aboard her father's flagship, was a three-part ordeal designed to test mental fortitude, physical endurance, and spiritual compatibility. It had been created centuries ago when bondings between different Nethesian clans required formal validation, and had evolved over time to encompass unions with other species. "No off-worlder has ever attempted it," Lyrics explained as they reviewed the historical records together. Her voice carried a mixture of fear and determination that Vex found both touching and inspiring. "The mental challenges alone have broken seasoned Nethesian warriors. The physical trials have killed participants who underestimated their difficulty. And the spiritual compatibility test," she shuddered. "Some who fail that trial emerge as completely different people, their personalities fundamentally altered by the experience." "But we have advantages now," Vex pointed out. "The architect enhancement changes everything." "True," Lyrics admitted, "but it also makes the trials more dangerous. The testing chambers will respond to our enhanced capabilities, scaling the challenges to match our new abilities." As they prepared for the trials, Vex found himself watching Lyrics with new appreciation. The transformation that had begun on Scarith Prime was continuing. She was becoming more confident, more herself, but also more connected to forces beyond normal understanding. "You know," he said as they reviewed tactical data together, "I'm starting to think your father planned more than just our meeting. I think he planned for us to fall in love." Lyrics looked up from her research with a smile that transformed her entire face. "Is that what happened? We fell in love." "Speak for yourself," Vex replied with mock seriousness. "I'm just along for the ride." She laughed and pulled him closer, and in that moment, surrounded by alien technology and facing impossible trials, Vex realized that he'd never been happier in his life. "Then I'll be the first off-worlder to succeed," Vex replied with more confidence than he actually felt. The bond between them had grown stronger over the past few days, and he could sense her genuine terror at the possibility of losing him to the trials. "Vex," she said softly, taking his hands in hers. "You don't have to do this. We could disappear, vanish into the Outer Rim territories where Nethesian law doesn't reach. We could create a life together away from all of this political complexity." Vex considered the option seriously. The Outer Rim was full of frontier worlds where a former military officer and a trained xenobiologist could probably make a decent living. They could raise their children, and Vex was increasingly certain there would be children, far from the pressures of galactic politics and ancient traditions. But something in him rebelled against the idea of running away. He'd spent his entire adult life serving something larger than himself, and the thought of abandoning that principle now felt like a betrayal of everything he'd worked to become. "No," he said finally, "if we're going to be together, it should be with your father's blessing and your people's acceptance. I won't have you cut off from your family and heritage because of me." The trials that followed tested not just Vex's capabilities, but the strength of their bond. Each challenge was designed to push them to their limits and beyond, to prove that their connection was strong enough to survive anything the galaxy might throw at them. The first trial took place in a chamber deep within the Nethesian flagship, a space that seemed to exist outside normal reality. The walls were covered with crystalline formations, similar to those that had started their entire adventure. But these crystals pulsed with rhythmic energy that suggested advanced technology rather than natural growth. The similarity to the ancient Scarethian ruins was unmistakable, and Vex wondered if there might be a connection between the two civilizations that history had forgotten. As he entered the chamber, the crystals responded to his enhanced physiology, scaling their output to match his new capabilities. Vex was required to navigate a complex maze while experiencing induced hallucinations based on his deepest fears and regrets. But these weren't ordinary illusions. They were enhanced by the same architect technology that had changed him, creating experiences that were more real than reality itself. He lived through scenarios where Lyrics died because of his choices, where their bonding destroyed both their civilizations, where their enhanced children became tyrants who enslaved the galaxy. Each vision was crafted with perfect psychological precision, designed to break his will and make him question everything he'd done. But the architect enhancement gave him something the original trial designers hadn't anticipated: a connection to Lyrics that transcended physical distance. Even in the depths of the maze, he could feel her presence in his mind, anchoring him to reality and reminding him of what they'd found together. When he emerged victorious from each trial, Lyrics was there waiting for him, and their connection grew stronger with each challenge overcome. 8 months later, their daughter was born aboard the Nethesian flagship, while it orbited a previously unexplored world that would become the first joint human-Nethesian colony. The birth itself was unlike anything either species had ever recorded. The child, they named her Nova, was extraordinary from her first breath. She had her mother's silver eyes and her father's stubborn determination, along with capabilities that amazed both species scientists. At only a few days old, she could manipulate light patterns with her tiny hands, while simultaneously solving spatial puzzles that challenged adult minds. More remarkably, she seemed to possess an innate understanding of the architect technology, causing dormant formations to activate simply by being near her. But most astonishing of all, she appeared to be in communication with something beyond normal perception: the transcended architects themselves. "She's going to change everything," Lyrics said softly, watching their infant daughter demonstrate abilities that shouldn't have been possible for someone so young. "Just like her mother," Vex replied, settling beside them on the observation deck where Scarith Prime was visible as a distant star. "Are you saying I'm trouble, Commander Torrin?" Lyrics asked with mock indignation, though she was smiling as she said it. "The best kind of trouble," Vex assured her, marveling at how much his life had changed in such a short time. "The kind that makes everything else seem worthwhile." As their ship turned toward new worlds and new possibilities, Vex reflected on the chain of events that had brought them together. A crashed transport, dangerous wildlife, alien thorns, and a stubborn woman who refused to follow safety protocols had combined to create something extraordinary. Not just their personal bond, but the next step in galactic evolution. Nova stirred in her mother's arms, her silver eyes opening to focus on Vex with unsettling intelligence. For just a moment, he could swear he saw the future reflected in those alien eyes. A galaxy where the barriers between species had been transcended, where consciousness itself had evolved beyond physical limitations. "Vex," Lyric said softly, "I need to thank you." "For what?" "For being stubborn enough to save my life, brave enough to bond with me, and foolish enough to face the trials for our future together." Vex laughed, the sound rich with contentment and anticipation. "And I need to thank you for being stubborn enough to ignore my advice about those crystal thorns." "Best mistake I never meant to make," Lyrics replied, echoing his earlier words. "So," Vex said, looking out at the stars that awaited their exploration, "was ignoring my advice about the protective equipment worth the price you paid?" Lyrics considered the question seriously, looking down at their daughter who would grow up to bridge not just worlds, but entire dimensions of existence, then at the man who had become her partner in evolution itself. "Vex Torin," she said finally, "getting stabbed by those thorns was the most expensive accident of my life. It cost me my arranged marriage, my father's political plans, my comfortable life as a diplomat's daughter, and my certainty about what the future would hold." She paused, smiling with an expression of pure joy that made Vex's heart skip a beat. "And I'd pay that price again without hesitation, because what I gained was worth infinitely more than what I lost." As their ship carried them toward the unknown, Vex realized that sometimes the most painful lessons really do lead to the greatest joys. And sometimes the best advice is the advice you choose to ignore.